You know, when you think of the Middle Ages, what comes to mind? Probably castles, knights, kings, all that classic stuff. But what if I told you the real story wasn't some fairy tale? It was more like a survival epic. This era wasn't static at all. It was this incredibly dynamic and honestly, pretty brutal period of collapse and desperate rebuilding. So let's dive in and explore how a completely new world was forged from the ashes of an old one.
And really, that brings us to the central question of all this. Just imagine for a second, what happens when an empire dies? Like the world's biggest superpower just, poof, vanishes. What comes next? For the folks living after the fall of Rome, this wasn't some academic question. It was their terrifying new reality.
Okay, so the Western Roman Empire collapses back in the 5th century. And look, this wasn't just some minor political change. It was like it ripped a giant hole in the center of the known world. It created this massive power vacuum, and that just threw the entire continent into absolute chaos.
It's honestly hard to wrap your head around how big of a change this was. I mean, the Roman world? It was all about unity, law, and massive trade networks that connected everyone. And then, suddenly, all of that was just gone, replaced by a daily, brutal struggle for survival in a world of constant warfare.
And it was this total domino effect, right? The constant warfare made trade way too dangerous. So what happens? Businesses collapse. People started fleeing the cities, which were becoming ghost towns for the countryside, hoping it was safer. And when your only goal is just to survive another day, things like higher learning, they go right out the window. Literacy just plummeted. Even Latin, the common language that held everything together, started to break apart and evolve into the different languages we have today.
So yeah, that massive unified empire, gone. In its place, Europe just shattered into a million little pieces, all these smaller competing kingdoms. And your loyalty? It wasn't to some far-off emperor or a big idea like Rome anymore. Nope. It was to the local warlord, the guy down the road who had the swords and the walls to actually protect you and your family.
But then, right when things seem darkest, a single figure emerges from all this chaos. And for a moment, it felt like a real, brilliant glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone could put all those shattered pieces back together. That king's name was Charlemagne. You might know him as Charles the Great. He becomes king of the Franks in 771, and he manages to do something that seemed totally impossible at the time. He created a real, organized empire right in the middle of all this darkness. I mean, what this guy accomplished was just staggering for the time. He didn't just conquer territory, he organized it. He expanded the Frankish kingdom, he spread Christianity, and, get this, in an age where almost nobody could read, he was all about learning. He actually built schools. For a little while there, it really seemed like the stability and order of the old Roman Empire might be making a comeback.
But it wasn't meant to be. After Charlemagne died in 814, his sons and grandsons just couldn't hold it together. They divided up the empire, and it crumbled almost as fast as it was built. That dream of a unified Europe, that last best chance for centuries, it pretty much died right there with him.
And as if that wasn't bad enough, just as the memory of that brief unity started to fade, Europe gets slammed by a whole new wave of devastating invasions. The chaos didn't just return, it came roaring back with a vengeance.
So for about 200 years, from 800 to 1000, Europe was basically under siege from every direction. You had the Vikings in their long ships raiding from the north. You had the Magyars, these incredible horsemen, attacking from the east. And you had Muslim forces invading from the south. It was a terrifying three-front war for survival.
So what about the kings who came after Charlemagne? Well, they were completely powerless. I mean, how could they not be? Their armies couldn't be everywhere at once. And people learned a hard lesson, fast. Trusting some distant king to protect you wasn't just a bad idea, it was a fatal one. This total desperation for safety is what led to a brand new system. And it wasn't something designed by a king in a castle. It was built from the ground up, out of pure necessity. We call it feudalism. And at its core, it's really just a pyramid built on a whole lot of promises.
I mean, really, put yourself in their shoes for a minute. You hear the horns. A Viking raid is coming. Your king, he's hundreds of miles away, completely useless to you. So who do you turn to? You turn to the local guy, the powerful lord with his own soldiers and a strong, defensible hull.
And that, right there, is the heart of feudalism. It's a deal, plain and simple. You've got these powerful landowners, the lords. They offer a piece of their land, it was called a fief, to a warrior, a knight. And in exchange for that land, the knight swears an oath to be loyal and to fight for that lord. It boils down to this: land for protection. That's the bargain.
So this whole system created a really clear social pyramid. Way up at the top, you had the king, but honestly, he had very little direct power. The real power players were the high-ranking lords and nobles who actually controlled the land. They would then grant pieces of that land to knights, who became their vassals, in exchange for fighting. And at the very bottom of it all, you had the peasants and serfs. Their hard labor supported literally everyone else, and all they got in return was that one single promise: protection. Okay, so we've talked about the big picture, but what did this actually look like for, the 90% of people at the bottom? Let's zoom in a bit and talk about the daily reality of life on what was called a manor.
The manor was basically the engine that made the entire feudal world run. Think of it like its own tiny, self-sufficient little world. Everything you could possibly need to survive, your food, your clothes, your tools, your house, it was all made and grown right there on the Lord's land. For most people, your entire life played out on that one piece of land. You were born there, you worked there, and you died there.
So let's break down that bargain in practical terms. What did the Lord provide? Well, he gave you a place to live, some land to farm for your own family, and most importantly, protection from invaders. And what did the peasant give in return? A lot. You had to work the Lord's personal fields, give him a chunk of the food you grew on your own land, and even pay taxes just to use things like the Lord's mill to grind your grain or his oven to bake your bread. And what was the result of this tough bargain? A life that was, on average, just 35 years long. 35. That single number, maybe more than anything else, tells you just how brutal and harsh daily life really was.
It was an incredibly short life, and it was filled with back-breaking physical labor from the moment the sun came up till it went down. And for the serfs who were legally tied to the manor, there was basically zero freedom. You couldn't leave, you couldn't get married, you couldn't do much of anything without getting permission from your lord first.
Of course, the whole reason that promise of protection was so valuable was because of one thing: constant, brutal warfare. And for all the lack of progress in some areas, medieval society poured an incredible amount of ingenuity into the tools of war. They came up with some truly terrifying weapons to attack and defend the castles that dotted the landscape. And listen to this, because nothing, and I mean nothing, captures the sheer brutality of medieval warfare like this. We're talking about the kinds of things launched from a trebuchet, which is like a giant slingshot. They weren't just throwing rocks. We're talking pots of burning lime, diseased cows, and even severed human heads. This wasn't just about knocking down walls. This was biological and psychological warfare, designed to spread disease and pure terror.
And all of this brings us right back to that central dilemma, doesn't it? This whole complicated social structure, from the king at the top to the serf at the bottom, it was all an answer to a violent, chaotic world. So you have to ask yourself, was the brutal, short, and unfree life that most people lived a necessary price to pay for simple survival? It's a tough question for sure, but it gets right to the very heart of what the Middle Ages were all about.